The candles in the nursery burned low by the time the infant's first cry faded into silence. It was the kind of silence that should have felt sacred, the hush that follows new life entering the world. But inside Windmere Estate, silence had long since learned to carry weight. It pressed down on the velvet drapes, settled into the carved cornices, and wound itself around Duchess Alara Ashford's chest like a cord pulled just tight enough to remind her it was there. She lay against the pillows, pale and damp, her dark hair loose across her shoulders. In her arms, the infant slept pink-cheeked, perfectly formed, utterly unaware that her arrival had already been deemed a disappointment by the man whose name she would carry. "She is beautiful," Bessie whispered from the corner, her voice careful and quiet the way all voices inside Windmere had learned to be. Alara looked down at her daughter's face and felt a love so immediate and so fierce that it frightened her. "Yes," she said softly, "she is." The door opened without a knock. Duke Cashin Ashford entered the nursery the way he entered every room, with absolute ownership, his posture erect, his expression arranged into something unreadable. He was a handsome man, broad-shouldered, with dark eyes that had once looked at Alara as though she were the only intelligent person in any given room. Those same eyes now swept across the bundle in her arms and registered the lace-trimmed blanket, the delicate curve of a daughter's sleeping face, and something behind his expression shuddered closed. He said nothing for a long moment. Alara watched him. She had rehearsed this in her mind through the long hours of labor, had told herself she would not ask for his warmth, would not reach for his hand, would simply present the truth of this child and let him find his own decency. She had believed, somewhere tender and stubborn inside herself, that the sight of a newborn might reach him where her words never could. He turned and walked to the window. "A third daughter," he said, "not to her." Almost to himself, or to the frost-edged glass beyond which Windmere's dark ground stretched away into the night. "Her name is Clara," Alara said. Her voice was steady. She had decided that too. Cashin did not repeat the name. He clasped his hands behind his back. "You should rest," he said, and left the room. 3 days later, the family council convened in the east drawing room. Alara was not invited. She learned of it through Bessie, who had learned of it through the undercurrents that ran beneath every great house, the whispered conferences of footmen, the significant silences of housekeepers. By the time Alara descended the main staircase that afternoon, composed and dressed as though nothing in her world were fracturing, she already knew the architecture of what had been decided. The Dowager Duchess sat nearest the fire, rigid and pale as the pearls at her throat. Lord Percival Ashford, Cashin's cousin, lean and watchful, a man who wore ambition like a second waistcoat, occupied the chair to her right. He looked up when Alara entered and had the grace, at least, to glance away. Cashin stood at the mantel. He looked at her directly. "I did not realize this concerned me," she said, "or I would have arranged to be included from the beginning." "Alara," his voice carried a warning she had once mistaken for protectiveness. "3 daughters," the Dowager said, as though Alara had not spoken at all. "The estate entail will not bend itself to sentiment, Cashin. You know this." Lord Percival said nothing. He had learned that in rooms like this one, silence at the right moment did more work than speech. Alara looked at her husband. "I would like to hear it from you," she said quietly. "Whatever has been decided, I would prefer it spoken plainly and directly, without the assistance of your family." Cashin dismissed the room with a look. The Dowager left with visible reluctance. Percival followed, and Alara did not miss the small, satisfied curve of his mouth as he passed. The door closed. Cashin moved to the writing desk and lifted a document that had been sitting there, she now realized, prepared and waiting. He held it out to her. "You will be relocated to Dunmore Cottage. It is a respectable property. You will want for nothing material. The girls will be provided for appropriately." He paused. "There will be no public announcement. The understanding will simply be that you prefer the country air." Alara did not take the document. She looked at it, then at him. "The country air," she repeated. "It is a reasonable arrangement." For a moment she said nothing. The fire crackled between them. She thought of 6 years of marriage, of the early years when he had read to her in this very room and argued philosophy and looked at her as an equal. She thought of the first daughter's birth when he had been merely distant, the second when he had been cold. She had kept believing there was a version of him capable of more. She understood now that she had been curating a fiction. "Do you feel nothing for me at all?" she asked, quietly. Without anger, she was past anger. She simply wanted to know. Cashin said nothing. His silence was more complete than any answer. Alara took the document from his hand, folded it with great care, and set it down on the desk between them. She smoothed the front of her dress, lifted her chin, and walked to the door. "I will leave before dawn," she said. "I would prefer not to be seen." She climbed the stairs, returned to the nursery, and held Clara against her chest for a long time in the dark. Her other daughters slept nearby. She pressed her lips to the infant's soft head and breathed carefully. She had not told him. She was not going to. The life growing quietly inside her belonged to no one who had chosen to stand in silence at a fireplace while she asked him if she mattered. She would carry it alone. She would carry all of it alone. Before the first gray light touched the grounds of Windmere Estate, a plain carriage rolled through the iron gates and disappeared into the road beyond. Nobody came to watch it leave. Avonmere did not care who she was. That was the first thing Alara noticed, and the first thing that allowed her to breathe. The village sat at the edge of the Dorset coast like something forgotten by ambition, its whitewashed cottages pressing close together against the salt wind, its harbor carrying the smell of fish and wood smoke and honest living. Nobody here read the society pages. Nobody tracked the movements of ducal households or measured a woman's worth by the gender of her children. When Alara arrived with Bessie, 3 small girls, and a single trunk of modest clothing, the landlady of the cottage on Harbor Lane looked her over once, decided she had a decent face and prompt hands, and handed her the key without ceremony. She gave her name as Mrs. Alara Voss, her mother's maiden name, worn now like a borrowed coat that over weeks began to fit. The cottage was small. After Windmere's vaulted ceilings and echoing corridors, it felt almost absurdly so. Low beams, a kitchen that doubled as a sitting room, a garden that was more ambition than achievement. Alara stood in the center of it on the first evening, the girls asleep upstairs, Bessie quiet beside her, and felt something she had not expected to feel: relief. Edmund was born on a Tuesday in early March, when the sea outside was loud and gray and indifferent. There was no physician present, only Bessie, and a village midwife named Mrs. Cord, who had delivered half of Avonmere and treated the entire business with brisk, competent calm. Alara labored through the night without complaint, which Mrs. Cord later told people was the mark of either tremendous courage or tremendous stubbornness, and she was not certain there was a meaningful difference. When it was over and the infant was placed in her arms, Alara looked down at her son. She had imagined, in the months of carrying him alone, that this moment might feel like vindication, that she might think of Cashin, of the document on the desk, of the silence at the fireplace. She had prepared herself for something complicated, triumph threaded through with bitterness. Instead, she felt only love. The same fierce and immediate love she had felt for each of her daughters, no different in weight or quality. She pressed her lips to his forehead and whispered his name, Edmund, and that was all. He was not an heir. He was not a weapon. He was her son, and she intended to raise him as though the word heir did not exist. She did not write to Windmere. She folded that decision quietly into herself and did not revisit it. The life she built was small by every measure she had previously been taught to apply. There were no seasons in London, no formal dinners, no performance of grace under the scrutiny of 100 calculated eyes. There was instead a garden that slowly began to respond to her attention, daughters who ran along the harbor wall and came home with salt in their hair, and neighbors who brought soup when Clara had a cough and expected nothing in return but the same. Alara found, to her own quiet surprise, that she was capable of more than she had ever been permitted to demonstrate inside Windmere's walls. She kept the household accounts with precision. She taught her daughters herself each morning: literature, mathematics, French, and independent thought, which she considered the most vital subject and the one least likely to be offered to them anywhere else. She became, without planning to, someone the village turned to. A letter written here, a dispute mediated there. She asked for nothing and gave what she could, and Avonmere, in the unspoken economy of small communities, returned that quietly and consistently. She was not happy in the simple sense of the word. She was something steadier than happy. She was building. It was Rosalind, her eldest, 7 years old and possessed of a fever that climbed stubbornly through 3 days, who first brought Dr. Sebastian Hale through the cottage door. He arrived in the early evening, bag in hand, recommended by Mrs. Cord, with the assurance that he was the finest physician within 30 miles, and the only one who didn't speak to women as though they were footnotes to their own symptoms. He was perhaps 35, with an open face that showed his thoughts more honestly than he likely intended, and the particular unhurried manner of a man who had learned that patience was not weakness but precision. He examined Rosalind with thoroughness and spoke to her directly, which immediately elevated him in Alara's estimation. He then explained the treatment to Alara in full, without simplifying it, which elevated him further. He returned the following 2 mornings to check on Rosalind's progress. On the 3rd morning, she was recovered and insisted on showing him the shell collection she kept on the windowsill. He sat on the edge of the bed and examined each shell with what appeared to be genuine interest. Alara watched from the doorway and felt something shift almost imperceptibly in the carefully ordered interior of her chest. She did not examine it immediately. She was a practical woman. He came back after Rosalind for other reasons, a question about Edmund's feeding, a remedy Bessie had asked after, small professional courtesies that accumulated with a logic Alara observed and chose for a time not to name. They talked. That was the plain truth of it. They talked the way Alara had not talked with anyone in years, without performance, without the careful management of impression, without the underlying awareness that she was being assessed. Sebastian spoke about his work, his late wife, the particular loneliness of being surrounded by people and still feeling separate from them. Alara spoke about her daughters, about books, about the way the coast looked in January when the tourists had all gone home, and it belonged entirely to itself. He told her once during one of these evenings that he had never met anyone who thought as clearly as she did and seemed so entirely unaware of it. She had looked at him over her tea and said, "I was aware of it. I was simply never in a room where it was considered an asset." He had laughed, a real laugh, unguarded, and something in that sound rearranged something in her. He proposed on a Sunday evening in October, with the garden going gold outside and Edmund asleep in the next room. He did it without theater, simply said that he loved her, that he loved her children, that he was not asking her to forget anything or replace anything, only to let him be present for whatever came next. She had the legal matter resolved within a month. Cashin's separation document, drawn in haste and arrogance, contained a clause her solicitor identified with quiet satisfaction, ground sufficient, under precise reading, to constitute dissolution of the marital bond. It was not simple. It required patience and precision. Alara had both. They married in the village church on a Wednesday morning in November. Rosalind wore flowers in her hair. Edmund, at 8 months old, slept through the entire ceremony in Bessie's arms. The girls threw dried lavender at the door. It was the smallest wedding Alara had ever attended. It was the only one that had ever felt entirely true. The letter arrived on a Thursday, 3 weeks later. Bessie brought it to her at the kitchen table, her face carrying the particular careful expression she wore when delivering news that required handling. The envelope bore no crest, but the handwriting on the address was not one Alara recognized, neat, professional, hired. She opened it. Read it once. Set it down on the table and looked out at the gray November sea for a long moment. Then she stood, smoothed her dress, and said to Bessie in a voice of complete composure, "We will need to go to London." London remembered her. That was the uncomfortable truth Alara felt the moment the carriage rolled past the first familiar streets, the cream-fronted townhouses, the iron railing slick with November rain, the particular gray light that fell over the city like a judgment. She had left this world in a plain carriage before dawn, invisible by design. She returned to it now in a hired coach with her husband beside her and her chin level, and the city looked exactly the same, which somehow made everything she had survived feel more rather than less significant. Sebastian sat quietly across from her, watching her face with the attentiveness she had come to understand was simply how he loved through observation, through presence, through the steady refusal to look away. "You do not have to speak first," he said. "I intend to speak first," she replied. "I intend to speak last as well. I have thought about very little else for 3 days." He smiled, and she felt the ground beneath her settle. Duke Cassian Ashford had received the intelligence on a Monday. Lord Percival had delivered it personally, with the performance of reluctant duty that he had long since perfected, the measured pace, the grave expression, the careful concealment of satisfaction. A son. The Duchess had borne a son, conceived within the marriage, carried in secret, delivered in a Dorset village, and now residing under another man's roof under another man's name. Percival had expected rage. He had built several private plans around the assumption of rage. What he received instead was silence, long, interior, and unreachable. Cassian had dismissed him from the room, stood at the window for an interval Percival could not measure from the corridor, and then sent for his solicitor. What Cassian felt, standing at that window, was not the clean heat of anger. It was something worse, the specific discomfort of a man confronted with the precise shape of his own failure. He had sent her away. He had handed her a document, offered her a cottage, and turned back to his fireplace while she asked him a question he had not had the courage to answer. And she had left carrying his air and said nothing, because he had given her no reason to believe he deserved to know. He traveled to Avonmere on Wednesday. The cottage on Harbour Lane was empty. The landlady told him, with the frank economy of village people who owed aristocrats nothing, that Mrs. Hale had departed for London 2 days prior. Mrs. Hale. He stood outside the empty cottage for a moment in the salt wind and then returned to his carriage. The meeting took place in the library of Cassian's London townhouse, which Alara had chosen deliberately. Not a drawing room, too social. Not a study, too much his territory. The library was neutral ground, and she had sat in it often enough in the early years of their marriage to know its proportions and feel no intimidation from them. She arrived with Sebastian, her solicitor, Mr. Gareth Finch, a compact man with sharp eyes and a leather case that he set on the table with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being underestimated, and Bessie, who waited in the entrance hall with Edmund. Cassian was already in the room when they entered. He looked older. Not severely, the months had not been unkind, but there was something behind his eyes that had not been there before, a particular quality of a man who had spent considerable time in his own company and found it less comfortable than expected. He looked at Alara first, then at Sebastian, and in that brief passage of his gaze between the two of them, Alara saw him understand everything completely. He said nothing about Sebastian's presence. She had half expected an objection. Instead, he gestured toward the chairs. "I will stand," Alara said. She laid out her terms without preamble. Her voice was clear and unhurried, Edmund's acknowledgement as legitimate heir, full custody with Sebastian and herself until Edmund reached schooling age, proper written settlements for each of her daughters, legally documented and immediately binding. In exchange, she would cooperate entirely with the formal recognition process and raise Edmund with full knowledge of his Ashford inheritance. "You have thought this through carefully," Cassian said when she finished. "I have had very little else to occupy me," she said evenly. "I was living quietly in Dorset." The faintest thing moved across his face, not quite flinching, something adjacent to it. Finch opened the leather case. The documents were already drafted. Alara had not come to negotiate, she had come to conclude. Cassian looked at the papers for a long moment, then looked up at her. Something in him appeared to be working toward speech that cost him considerably. "Alara," he said, "I am what I did was." "Not necessary," she said. gently but finally. "What is necessary is your signature." He looked at Sebastian once more. Sebastian met his gaze without hostility and without apology, simply as a man who was present and intended to remain so. Cashin picked up the pen. It was precisely then that the library door opened. Lord Percival entered without invitation, which was entirely consistent with his character, accompanied by a second solicitor, a tall, colorless man named Briggs whom Finch recognized immediately by reputation. Percival's expression carried the bright, managed energy of someone who believed he held a superior hand. "I must object," Percival said, addressing the room at large in the manner of a man who had rehearsed this entrance. "The legitimacy of this child is legally contestable. The Duchess was separated from the Duke at the time of the birth. Edmund Voss, or whatever name he has been given, cannot be entered into the Ashford line without full legal scrutiny, and I intend to ensure—" "Edmund Ashford," Alara said. Percival paused. Finch stepped forward, opened a second document, and placed it on the table in front of Briggs with the calm precision of a man playing a card he had been holding since the beginning. "The child was conceived a full 6 weeks prior to the signing of the separation document," he said pleasantly. "We have the midwife's signed testimony, the physician's record, and a dated letter from the Duchess's own hand confirming the pregnancy before departure from Windermere. Edmund is legitimate beyond any legal challenge you are equipped to mount, Lord Percival. I would be delighted to demonstrate that in open court, if you prefer. The publicity would be considerable." The room was very quiet. Percival looked at Briggs. Briggs looked at the document. The document looked back at him with the patient indifference of irrefutable fact. Cashin set the pen down slowly and looked at his cousin with an expression Alara had never seen on his face before, not anger, but something colder and more final than anger. "Get out of my house, Percival," he said quietly. Percival left. Cashin picked up the pen again, and in the silence of the library, with rain moving against the tall windows and the fire burning low, he signed his name to every page that Alara had placed before him. When it was done, Finch collected the documents with brisk efficiency. Sebastian's hand found Alara's, not dramatically, simply, and she let it stay. Cashin looked at her one last time across the table. His voice, when it came, was stripped of its usual composure. "Did you ever love me?" he asked. Alara considered him, this man she had believed in, built her early life around, and finally, necessarily survived. "I loved who I believed you were," she said. "That man did not exist." The words did not land like a blow. They landed like a door, closing not in anger, but with the quiet finality of a woman who had already built her home somewhere else. She turned and walked out of the library and did not look back.